Hello, History 50, and welcome to my lecture. My name is Arthur Henry, and I am the TA of the class. Unfortunately, we aren't able to meet in person. I've been following the class like a fly on the wall for the semester. But that being said, I am really excited to share my lecture with you. And of course, this is Concepts of Warfare. And this is ranging from antiquity to early modern Europe. So a little about myself. Yes, my name is Arthur Henry. I am a master's candidate in history at California State University, Sacramento. I'm also a research assistant for the Shattuck Endowment. And what I do is I transcribe advertisements about indentured servitude, mostly about runaway servants. And this is taking place around the colonial America period. And of course, I'm also a Sierra College alumni. And on my off time, what helps me put this lecture together is I'm also assistant instructor at the Sacramento Historical Fencing School, where we focus on historical European martial arts, fencing, longsword, the rapier, halberds, polearms. So, in pretty much a nutshell, I play with swords. And I also teach people how to use a sword so they can safely play with others. Because one of my mottos is, if you break your friends, you can't play with them. But that being said, I've been doing this for about 15 years. I also compete across the West Coast. And just, of course, a little fun tidbit right here. We'll talk about the sword towards the end of the lecture and about some other pieces of equipment that are a bit, what would be the best way to say it? A lot of it, there's misconceptions about it, thanks to Hollywood, but we'll hopefully clear some of that up. And of course, yes, and here I'm using what's called the rapier and dagger. I'm competing at SoCal Sword Fight, which is in Southern California. And this is me using a longsword, stabbing someone so that they cannot try to hit me in the head. So, what this lecture is about is some of the causes of warfare. There, of course, we're not going to cover all of them, but some of the primary concepts, and of course, to supplement the course. And we're going to look at some of the innovations of military technology that transpired from antiquity to early modern Europe. And we're going to also look at the development of tactics and strategies. And the last portion is going to be kind of show and tell. I got some cool examples of pieces from museums, and we're going to look at some interesting videos about the full suit of armor. That being said, let's get into the lecture. So, one of the causes of warfare is fighting for the accumulation of resources. And one of the most valued resources during antiquity was bronze. And bronze is made from the metallurgy of combination of tin and copper. And this makes it a rather valuable commodity for producing blades, armor, and tools, which of course is not the strongest metal. As we can see, it will be phased out by iron. And if you, depending on the location you are in, you're not going to have access to both tin and copper. So you're going to have to go get it from someone else. And a lot of times those other kingdoms aren't going to be willing to give you their goods. And we can see example of this in the Epic of Gilgamesh, particularly when he is going out to distant lands to get timber, and as we can see from this passage, but I will put my hand to it, and will cut down the cedar, an everlasting name I will establish for myself. Orders, my friend, to the armorers I will give. Weapons they shall cast in our presence. Orders to the armorers they gave. The craftsmen sat down and held a conference. Great weapons they cast. Axes of 3 talents each they cast. Great swords they cast. So pretty much we have these military leaders organizing these expeditions to go out and get materials that they were unable to accumulate in their own territories. Which, of course, a more amicable and peaceful route is to trade. And, of course, part of these military engagements and forming an army is to maintain these trade routes. And, of course, why not raise as many soldiers as possible? There's a few challenges of doing that. Raising an army has a set of challenges, and we can see with Sargon of Akkad, king of Kish, he won about 34 campaigns, and his host was about 54,000 men. That's a pretty massive army. The question is, how are you going to feed them? And, of course, when you have that big host, and you don't have a set supply line or a means of feeding them, the only other option is for them to forage. And this is very problematic, as it devastates fertile landscapes and makes it difficult for the peasants to maintain the food supply. And of course, if you're conquering territories and you have your army foraging on the land, they're not going to be getting that food peacefully from the peasants, and that's going to make it very difficult to pacify the populations that you are trying to incorporate into your territory. Which, of course, Sargon had his massive host, which made him difficult to beat and held superiority over other tribesmen. And, of course, disease wiped out most of them. So, that being said, when we get to Xerxes in the Persian Empire, he made sure to establish a form of bureaucracy to maintain his army. And he found that it was more beneficial to implement a form of taxation where the peasants would donate about a portion of their foods annually to maintain the army. And this helped him when he started his invasion to try to go conquer the Greek states. So, one of the innovations of military technology is the chariot. And of course, you've probably seen the chariot in movies and all this other forms of television programs. And what made the chariot a force to be reckoned with was the fact that it was mobile and it had the firepower. Now, as we can see here, you had to have 2 horses, the driver, and then you got the archer. And it took quite a bit of craftsmanship in order to build a chariot. And of course, the invention of the spoked wheel with friction-reducing hub and axle design made it even more favorable to use. Because let's face it, if you got a rickety wheels and a chariot, it's very difficult to try to shoot a bow. And of course, this was primarily in the Middle East that it was used, and Egypt. Europe, there are some instances where chariots were used. An example in Homer's works, the heroes, they would use chariots, but then they would dismount and fight on foot, which, of course, if you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, he has strong favorability and ideals of what was a hero. Because during the Trojan Wars in the Iliad, it's all about Kleos, which is glory and victory. And the charioteers, they became part of the ruling class because they were the ones that were able to have the funds in order to secure themselves a chariot, the horses, maintaining it. And we will see this in Europe in the feudal ages, where the knights are going to be the one accumulating power because they're able to fight and defend themselves, and peasants look to them to defend them. As we see the development of stirrups, horseback riding became preferable to chariots. Because one, you do not need 2 horses, and you don't need a driver, and you do not need to devote so much resources to building these chariots. And of course, the ones that popularized the use of horseback were the steppe nomads, where they used it for riding for massive raids. So they would raid territories, the cities. And so then you would have rulers bribing most of these tribes as form of border security to maintain their territory and prevent any more raiding. And as we'll see, that their reliance on horseback, they will migrate with the horses in the grasslands. So you have this Sumerian, Scythian societies, the Huns, the Mongols. They will go where the horses are going, where they're grazing for the grass. And of course, the cultivation of alfalfa cheapened the cost of upkeep for horses. And that being said, the nutrients allowed for the domestication and maintaining of like bigger horses, war horses, and the incorporation of heavy cavalry. And heavy cavalry's job is put armor on, shields, and form a shock troops to disrupt the lines of infantry. Which we'll discuss a little bit further about the steppe nomads. Spoiler alert, Mongols. All right, and of course, the phalanx. I like to call this the linebackers of warfare. Very defensive, as you can see, all those spears. You have the shields interlocking. And the benefit of this is you can compact massive amounts of soldiers together with a massive amount of defensive capability and offense. Which, of course, the Greek states used this against the Persian invasion, primarily the Battle of Marathon, where they were able to utilize the terrain to their advantage to have the Persians form a choke point to where they would be forced to funnel into these phalanxes. And of course, the story about like 300, which is not really 300. There's the Athenian fleet, and of course other Greek state soldiers helping out. They don't like to talk about that, but that's how they were able to hold off considerable, overwhelming force, is that they utilized the terrain to their advantage to create these choke points, forcing the massive amount of soldiers to funnel in to these phalanxes. Though the disadvantage was mobility. It took a tremendous amount of skill and training to interlock, and you're not going to be very mobile. So that being said, you're going to be vulnerable on your flanks and in the back. Which, of course, the Romans will take full advantage of this. Here's an example of hoplite armor. This is made of bronze. As you can see, the oxidization on the helmet. And is mostly breastplate, helmet, forearm guards, and the hoplite soldier was required to maintain their own arms and armor.